Sometimes a man reaches the end of his road and realizes he's got one last chance to make things right. Clay Bannon spent his final dollar on a broken-down cabin and a dog, hoping to find the peace that's eluded him for 50 years. The cabin sits deep in the Montana wilderness, where his father once lived. It's falling apart, but it's home. Clay is tired and his past weighs heavy. Every day he fixes what he can and talks to that dog like an old friend. But when a stranger shows up claiming the land belongs to him, Clay faces a choice. Can he let go of the violence that defined him and finally find redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wagon creaked to a stop at the end of a trail that had disappeared into wild grass and fallen timber years ago. Clay Bannon sat on the bench, reins loose in his weathered hands, and looked at what remained of his father's dream. The cabin stood, barely, against a backdrop of pine-covered mountains that stretched toward a sky the color of old pewter. October wind carried the smell of coming snow and rotting leaves. He climbed down slow, favoring his left leg where a bullet had shattered his knee back in '71. 24 years ago, and it still ached when the weather turned. The dog jumped down after him, a rangy mutt with rust-colored fur, and one ear that flopped while the other stood straight. Clay had bought him off a widow in Silverbow for $2. The woman said his name was Rust, and Clay figured that was as good a name as any for a dog with fur that color and a man with a soul gone to corrosion. "Well, Rust," Clay said, his voice rough from 3 days of silence on the trail. "This is it. What do you think?" The dog sniffed the air, tail wagging uncertainly, then looked back at Clay as if waiting for reassurance that this broken-down place was really going to be home. Clay understood the feeling. He'd paid his last silver dollar and every crumpled bill in his pockets for this property, cabin and 40 acres, to a man in a Butte saloon who'd sworn he had legal title. The man had smelled like whiskey and desperation, which should have been Clay's first warning, but desperation recognizes its own kind. And Clay had been too eager for a chance at redemption to ask the right questions. The cabin was worse than he'd imagined from the man's description. The roof sagged in the middle, and whole sections of shingles were missing on the north side. One of the front windows had been boarded over with planks that had weathered to the color of old bones. The porch listed to the left, and several of the support posts had rotted through at the base. The door hung crooked on leather hinges that his father had crafted by hand. Clay remembered those hinges, remembered watching his father cut the leather, remembered the careful way he'd attached them, explaining to 8-year-old Clay that a man took pride in every part of his work, even the parts nobody saw. That was 42 years ago, before Clay's mother died of fever. Before his father drank himself to death over the course of one long, terrible winter. Before Clay had taken up with the wrong men and learned that his hands were steady and his conscience was quiet when it came to killing. He walked to the cabin, Rust padding beside him. The steps groaned under his weight but held. He pushed the door open and it scraped across the floor, leaving a curved mark in the dust. The interior was a single room, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, with a stone fireplace taking up most of the far wall. A wooden table sat in the center, one leg shorter than the others. 2 chairs, both intact. A rope bed frame in the corner, the ropes long since rotted away. Shelves on the walls, empty except for mouse droppings, and the desiccated corpse of a bird that had somehow gotten in and couldn't find its way out. But there, hanging crooked on the wall beside the fireplace, was his father's wooden cross. Clay's breath caught. His father had carved it from pine, simple and unadorned, just 2 pieces joined with wooden pegs and faith. His father had been a believer, had read from the Bible every night by lamplight, had prayed before meals, even when meals were nothing but boiled oats and hope. Clay took the cross down, turned it over in his hands. His father's knife marks were still visible in the wood, each cut deliberate and sure. Clay couldn't remember the last time he'd prayed. Couldn't remember the last time he'd believed in anything beyond the next town, the next card game, The next man who wanted to test himself against Clay Bannon's reputation. He hung the cross back on its nail, straightened it. Rust had already found a sunny spot near the door and curled up, apparently satisfied that this would do. Clay spent the rest of that first day taking inventory. The stone fireplace was sound. His father had built things to last. The floor had soft spots, but most of the boards were solid. The walls had gaps where the chinking had fallen out, and wind whistled through like the cabin was breathing. He'd need to fix the roof before the serious snow came, which gave him maybe 3 weeks if he was lucky. He had tools in the wagon, not many, but enough. A hammer, a saw, nails he'd collected over the years, some spare rope. He had a bedroll and blankets, a coffee pot, a frying pan, and enough dried beans and salt pork to last a month if he was careful. He had 6 bullets for his Colt revolver, which hung heavy on his hip out of habit, more than expectation he'd need it. That night, he built a fire in the fireplace and was grateful when it drew properly, smoke rising up the chimney instead of filling the room. He made coffee and fried salt pork and shared half with Rust. They ate in silence while the fire crackled and shadows danced on the walls. The cabin was cold despite the fire. Clay wrapped himself in blankets and lay on the floor near the hearth. Rust settled against his side, warm and solid. Through the gaps in the roof, Clay could see stars, more stars than he'd seen in years. In towns, the lights drowned them out. But here, they filled the sky like diamond chips scattered across black velvet. He thought about his father. Thought about the man who'd built this cabin with his own hands, who'd cleared the land and planted crops that the harsh Montana winters killed more often than not. His father had been a gentleman, quiet and kind, the sort who believed hard work and faith could overcome any hardship. He'd been wrong. The land had broken him, and whiskey had finished the job. Clay had been 14 when his father died. He'd buried him on a rise overlooking the cabin under a pine tree. He wondered if the grave was still there, or if time and weather had erased even that small marker of his father's existence. After his father died, Clay had left, fallen in with a group of men who were running from something or toward something, he never knew which, and didn't care. They taught him to shoot, taught him to play cards, taught him that some men were born to work land and other men were born to take what they wanted. Clay had turned out to be good at taking. His first kill was a drunk cowboy in a Colorado mining camp who'd accused Clay of cheating at cards. Clay had been cheating, but that didn't make the accusation any less insulting. The cowboy had drawn first, but Clay's draw had been faster. He was 17 years old, and he'd felt nothing when the man dropped dead in the dirt, except a distant surprise at how easy it had been. After that, it got easier still. Over the next 33 years, Clay had killed. He'd lost count somewhere around 20, but it was more than that. Some had been fair fights, some hadn't. He'd worked as hired muscle, as a bodyguard, as an enforcer for men who did their violence through proxies. He'd been shot 4 times and stabbed twice, and had the scars to prove everyone. He'd never married, never had children, never stayed in one place long enough to call it home. And then, 10 years ago, in a town called Redemption, the irony of the name was not lost on him, he'd killed a man who turned out to be a father of 3. The man had drawn on Clay over a disagreement about a card game, and Clay had done what he'd always done. But afterward, when the man's wife had come running and his children had stood crying over their father's body, something inside Clay had cracked. He'd left Redemption that night and hadn't drawn his gun on a man since. He'd drifted, working odd jobs when he could find them, playing cards for small stakes, drinking more than was wise, and growing older with each passing year. His hands had started to shake. His eyesight wasn't what it used to be. His reputation, which had once opened doors and kept him fed, had faded to the point where most young gunmen didn't even recognize his name. He was 64 years old. He was tired. And when he'd heard about land for sale in Montana, near where his father's old homestead had been, he'd felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Hope. Maybe he'd thought he could go back to the beginning. Maybe he could find some kind of peace in the place where his life had started before it all went wrong. So he'd spent every dollar he had, and now here he was, lying on the floor of his father's cabin with a dog for company and a past that followed him like a shadow. Rust stirred, made a soft sound in his sleep. Clay reached out and rested his hand on the dog's side, feeling the rise and fall of breath. It was a comfort, that simple rhythm. Proof of life, uncomplicated and faithful. "We're going to make this work," Clay whispered to the dog, to the cabin, to the ghosts of his father and all the men he'd killed. "We're going to make this right." The fire burned low. Wind moved through the pines outside with a sound like distant voices. Clay closed his eyes and, for the first time in years, slept without nightmares. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Frost covered the ground, and Clay's breath misted in the air as he stepped outside. The mountains stood sharp against the eastern sky, their peaks already dusted with snow. A raven called from somewhere in the timber, its voice harsh and knowing. Clay spent that day and the next working on the cabin. He patched the worst of the roof gaps with canvas from the wagon, knowing it was temporary, but better than nothing. He replaced the rotten porch posts with logs he cut from fallen timber. He mixed mud and moss to chink the gaps in the walls. His hands remembered the work even if his back protested. This was the kind of labor his father had done. Honest work that left you tired but satisfied. Rust explored the property. Chasing squirrels he had no hope of catching. Drinking from the creek that ran cold and clear about 100 yards downslope from the cabin. The dog seemed to understand this was home now, and he stayed close, always within sight. On the third day, Clay walked up the rise where he thought his father's grave might be. He found it after some searching, a depression in the ground beneath the pine tree, the wooden cross he'd carved as a boy long since rotted away. He stood there for a long time, hat in his hands, trying to find words. "I'm back, Pa," he finally said. "I know I'm not the son you wanted. I know I wasted the life you gave me. But I'm here now, and I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to be more like you." The wind moved through the pine needles overhead, and Clay chose to believe that was answer enough. He walked back down to the cabin and saw something that made him stop. Smoke rose from a campfire on the ridge across the valley, maybe 2 miles distant. Someone was watching. Clay felt his hand drift toward his gun, old instincts kicking in, then forced himself to relax. Maybe it was just a trapper. Maybe it meant nothing. But that night, lying in his bedroll with Rust beside him and the fire dying to embers, Clay couldn't shake the feeling that his past had finally caught up with him, or that his fragile peace was about to be tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. The rider came up the trail on the 5th day, just after noon, when the sun was high and warm enough to make Clay sweat through his shirt as he worked on replacing rotted floorboards. Rust heard the horse first and went to the door, ears forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Clay set down his hammer and stood slowly, his knee popping. He stepped to the window and watched a man on a fine bay horse pick his way up the overgrown trail. The rider wore a suit, unusual for these parts, and sat his saddle like someone who'd learned to ride but hadn't been born to it. Behind him, tied to his saddle, was a leather case that looked like it might hold documents. The rider stopped 20 feet from the cabin and dismounted with care. He was younger than Clay, by maybe 20 years, clean-shaven, with dark hair going gray at the temples. His suit was well-tailored but dusty from the trail. "Mr. Bannon?" he called out. Clay felt ice form in his stomach. Nobody knew he was here. Nobody should know his name. "Who's asking?" "My name is James Cordell. I wonder if we might talk for a few minutes. I've ridden a long way, and the matter is important." Clay studied him. The man didn't wear a gun that Clay could see. Clay nodded slowly. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Cordell tied his horse and followed Clay into the cabin. His eyes took in the rough interior, the patches and repairs, the sparse furnishings. Clay poured coffee into 2 tin cups, and both men sat at the table. "How did you find me?" Clay asked. "I made inquiries in Butte. A bartender remembered you asking about property in this area." Cordell sipped his coffee and set the cup down. "Mr. Bannon, I'm an attorney representing the Consolidated Timber Company out of Chicago. I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Clay waited. Cordell reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. He spread it on the table between them. This is the deed to this property, 40 acres including the cabin and water rights. It was filed with the Territorial Land Office in Helena 8 years ago. The property belongs to my client. Clay looked at the document. It was official, stamped and signed, the writing in formal legal language he struggled to pass. But he could read enough to see the description matched his land. I bought this property fair and square. Got a bill of sale. May I see it? Clay retrieved the paper from his bedroll. He handed it to Cordell. The lawyer examined it, his expression sympathetic but firm. Mr. Bannon, the man who sold you this property, a Mr. Fletcher, had no legal right to do so. He was a con man. We've been tracking him for 2 years. He sold this same property to at least 3 other people. The law caught up with him in Denver last month. Then those other people all had to vacate. I'm sorry. The law is clear on this matter. You purchased property from someone who didn't own it. That makes the sale invalid. Clay felt something cold and dark rise in his chest. I spent everything I had on this land. I understand, and I am genuinely sorry. But my client has plans for this area. They're going to harvest the timber over the next 5 years. We'll need you to vacate the property. When? 2 weeks. I'll return then with workers to begin clearing operations. If you're still here, I'll have to involve the territorial marshal. Cordell's voice softened. Mr. Bannon, I know this is hard, but the law is the law. You were defrauded, and that's a terrible thing. But it doesn't change the fact that you're occupying land that isn't yours. Clay stared at the document on the table. His father's land. His last chance. Gone, because he'd been desperate and foolish enough to trust a con man in a saloon. What if I don't leave? Cordell met his eyes. Then you'll be forcibly removed. Mr. Bannon, I checked into your background before I rode out here. I know who you are. I know what you were. I'm asking you not to make this harder than it needs to be. The days of settling disputes with violence are over. This is 1895. We settle things with law now. Clay's hand trembled. Not from age this time, but from rage barely contained. The old Clay would have drawn on this man, consequences be damned. But that Clay had killed a father in front of his children, and the new Clay had made a promise. 2 weeks, Clay said. 2 weeks. Cordell stood, relief evident in his posture. He folded the deed and returned it to his jacket, leaving Clay's worthless bill of sale on the table. For what it's worth, I hope you land on your feet. Clay didn't respond. Cordell let himself out, mounted his horse, and rode back down the trail. Clay sat at the table long after the sound of hoofbeats faded, staring at the piece of paper that represented every dollar he'd owned, and the end of his last hope. Rust whined and put his head on Clay's knee. Clay reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, the simple motion keeping him anchored when everything inside him wanted to explode. He picked up the bill of sale, read it again, as if reading it would somehow make it legitimate. But he could see it now for what it was, crude compared to Cordell's official deed, the signature probably false. He'd been so desperate to believe in the possibility of redemption that he hadn't seen the con. "Damn it," he whispered. Then louder, "Damn it!" He stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. He paced the cabin, 5 steps to the wall, turn, 5 steps back. Rust watched him with worried eyes. Clay felt the weight of his revolver on his hip, felt the familiar urge to ride after Cordell and settle this the way he'd settled. Everything for 33 years, but that would make him exactly what he'd been. Killer who solved problems with violence because he didn't know any other way. And where had that gotten him? Alone, broke, haunted by ghosts, clinging to a false hope because he had nothing else. He stopped in front of his father's cross. "What do I do, Pa?" His father would have accepted it, would have packed up and left, trusting that God had a plan. His father had been a better man than Clay would ever be, but Clay wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. He grabbed his coat and hat. "Come on, Rust. We're going to town." The ride to Timber Ridge took 2 days. Clay pushed hard, driven by a need to do something before the 2 weeks ran out. Timber Ridge was a logging town with 2 sawmills and a main street lined with businesses. Clay rode in at dusk, exhausted and sore. He found the saloon and asked the bartender about lawyers. The man laughed. Fellow named Gideon Hart got an office above the general store. He drinks too much and loses at cards, but I never heard anyone say he cheated a client. In the morning, Clay found Hart's office. The lawyer was younger than Clay expected, maybe 40, with red hair and sharp eyes. Clay told him everything: the land purchase, the con man, Cordell's visit, the 2-week deadline. When Clay finished, Hart leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Mr. Bannon, I'll be straight with you. You don't have a case. The law is clear. You can't acquire legal title from someone who doesn't have it to give. The timber company has a valid deed. You have a fraudulent bill of sale. That's the beginning and end of it. There's nothing I can do. You could sue Fletcher for fraud, but he's in jail in Denver with no assets. You'd win a judgment you could never collect. You could refuse to leave and force them to court, but that only delays the inevitable and might land you in jail." Clay felt the last of his hope drain away. "So I'm finished." Hart's expression softened. "The frontier is changing, Mr. Bannon. The law is taking over from the gun. My advice, take your 2 weeks. Find another place. Start over while you still can. I'm 64 years old. I've got no money and a past that follows me everywhere. Where exactly am I supposed to start over?" Hart had no answer for that. Clay stood and walked out. He stood on the wooden sidewalk, looking at the main street, feeling more lost than he had in his entire life. He'd survived gunfights and hard winters and decades of violence, but he had no idea how to survive this. The simple, legal destruction of his last hope. Rust pressed against his leg, and Clay realized his hand was shaking, not from age, from the terrible understanding that he had nowhere to go and nothing to hold on to. Clay rode back to the cabin in silence, his thoughts churning like a storm he couldn't outrun. The 2-day journey gave him too much time to think, too much time to feel the weight of his failure pressing down on him. By the time he crested the final ridge and saw the cabin below, nestled against the pine-covered slope, he felt hollowed out. The property looked different now. Before, it had been possibility, a place where he might build something decent from the wreckage of his life. Now it was borrowed time, a temporary shelter that would be torn away in less than 2 weeks. Every board he'd replaced, every gap he'd chinked, every moment of peace he'd felt, all of it built on sand. Rust bounded ahead, happy to be home, and the dog's simple joy made Clay's chest ache. Even the dog didn't understand. They'd be moving on soon, adrift again with nowhere to go. Clay unsaddled his horse and turned it into the small corral he'd repaired. He carried his saddlebags into the cabin and dropped them on the floor. The space felt emptier than it had before, despite nothing having changed. His father's cross still hung crooked on the wall. The table still sat in the center with its uneven legs. But the warmth was gone, replaced by the cold knowledge that none of this was his. He built a fire more from habit than need and sat at the table with a cup of coffee. The fraudulent bill of sale lay where he'd left it, a mocking reminder of his foolishness. He picked it up, looked at Fletcher's signature, probably not even the con man's real name, and felt rage flare hot in his gut. For 33 years, he'd been the dangerous one. Men had feared him, crossed the street to avoid him, bought him drinks to stay on his good side, and now? Now he was just an old fool who'd been tricked out of his last dollar by a saloon grifter. The humiliation burned worse than any bullet wound. He stood and paced to the window. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Beautiful country. His father had chosen well when he'd claimed this land all those years ago. Clay wondered what his father would think of him now, broke, desperate, clinging to a place that wasn't his and never would be. A sound made him turn. Rust had his nose pressed to the door, tail wagging. Clay opened it and the dog shot out, barking at something in the growing darkness. Clay followed, his hand instinctively checking his revolver. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, a woman, he realized with surprise. She was older, maybe 50, with grey streaking through her dark hair. She wore a simple dress and a shawl against the evening cold, and she held a basket covered with a cloth. "Mr. Bannon," Her voice was steady, unafraid despite Rust's barking. "I'm Eleanor Wright. I live about 3 miles east, over the ridge. I heard you'd taken up residence here," Clay called Rust back. The dog obeyed reluctantly, still suspicious. "Mrs. Wright, you're a long way from home at this hour. I won't stay long. I just wanted to bring you these." She stepped forward and offered the basket. "Some bread and preserves. Welcome to the valley such as it is." Clay took the basket, confused by the kindness. People didn't usually seek him out with gifts. "That's neighborly of you. Thank you. My husband and I, God rest him, he passed 2 years ago. We knew your father, Samuel Bannon. He was a good man. When I heard his son had come back, I wanted to pay my respects." Clay felt something catch in his throat. "You knew my father." "We did. He helped us when we first came to the valley. Gave us seed corn when ours failed, helped my husband build our barn. He was the kind of neighbor who made this hard country a little easier to bear." She paused. "I was sorry to hear what happened to him, and sorrier still that you'd left. I was young and stupid. You were young and hurting. There's a difference." Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter. "I heard about your trouble with the timber company. News travels even out here." "I'm sorry for that too." Clay's jaw tightened. "Word gets around fast. Gideon Hart drinks at the Broken Wheel. He mentioned it to the bartender, and the bartender mentioned it to a logger, and the logger's wife is my nearest neighbor." She gave a sad smile. "That's how news travels in small places. I wanted you to know some of us remember your father, remember the good he did, and we're sorry about what's happening to you." "Sorry doesn't change anything." "No, it doesn't, but sometimes it helps to know you're not alone." She gestured to the basket. "The bread is fresh this morning. The preserves are from my own raspberries. I hope they bring you some comfort." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Mr. Bannon, I don't know what you're planning to do when your 2 weeks are up, but if you need anything, a meal, a place to stable your horse, just someone to talk to, you're welcome at my place. Your father's son is always welcome." Clay watched her walk back into the darkness, her form disappearing into the trees. He stood there long after she'd gone, holding the basket, feeling something he hadn't felt in decades, the simple weight of human kindness. Inside, he uncovered the basket. 2 loaves of bread, still slightly warm. 3 jars of preserves, deep red and carefully sealed. He broke off a piece of bread and ate it slowly. It was good bread made with care and skill. The preserves were sweet and tart at the same time, tasting of summer and sun. Rust looked up hopefully, and Clay shared a piece of bread with him. "What do you think, boy?" "There's still decent people in the world." "Who knew?" But the kindness, while touching, didn't solve his problem. He still had less than 2 weeks, still had nowhere to go and no money to get there. The bread wouldn't change that. That night, lying in his bedroll with Rust curled beside him, Clay stared up through the gaps in the roof at the stars beyond. He thought about his father, about Eleanor Wright's words. His father had been the kind of man who helped his neighbors, who made the hard country easier to bear. Clay had spent his life doing the opposite, making the world harder, more dangerous, more cruel. He thought about the men he'd killed. Most of them had probably deserved it in the rough justice of the frontier, but some hadn't. Some had just been in the wrong place or said the wrong thing or looked at Clay the wrong way when he was drunk and angry. And that man in redemption, the father of 3, he'd definitely not deserved it. He'd been protecting his own honor, and Clay had killed him for it. "I'm trying to be better, Pa," Clay whispered to the darkness. "I'm trying to be the man you were, but I don't know how. I don't know if it's even possible for someone like me." The wind answered with a low moan through the pines. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled. Rust stirred and pressed closer to Clay's side. Clay closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep was a long time coming. When it finally arrived, it brought dreams of his father building the cabin, board by board, while young Clay watched and learned. In the dream, his father looked at him and smiled. "It's never too late, son. It's never too late to do the right thing." Clay woke before dawn, with those words still echoing in his mind. He lay there in the grey light, thinking about what the right thing might be. He could leave peacefully when Cordell returned, as the lawyer had advised. That would be the safe choice, the legal choice, or he could fight. Not with his gun, he'd made that promise. But there had to be another way. Had to be something he could do that didn't involve violence, but didn't involve surrender either. He just had to figure out what that was before his time ran out. Clay spent the next 3 days working on the cabin with a fierce determination that surprised even himself. If he only had 2 weeks here, he'd make sure the place was in the best shape it could be. Maybe it was foolish to repair a home he'd never truly owned, but it felt like the only thing he could control. Every board he replaced, every gap he filled, was a small act of defiance against the chaos threatening to swallow him whole. On the morning of the 4th day, he climbed onto the roof to replace the worst of the damaged shingles. The work was slow and careful. His balance wasn't what it used to be, and a fall from this height could break bones that wouldn't heal right at his age. Rust watched from below, occasionally barking encouragement or warning. Clay couldn't tell which. He was hammering a shingle into place when he heard a horse approaching. He looked up to see a young man riding into the clearing, barely 20, with sandy hair and a lean build. The rider wore work clothes and carried himself with the careful wariness of someone who'd learned to be cautious around strangers. "Mr. Bannon?" the young man called up. Clay set down his hammer. "That's me. My name is Thomas Wright. Eleanor Wright is my mother. She sent me to see if you needed any help with repairs." Clay climbed down the ladder slowly, testing each rung. His knee complained with every step. When he reached the ground, he got a better look at the young man. Thomas had his mother's dark eyes and a genuine quality to his expression that made Clay think of honest people, the kind he'd spent most of his life avoiding. "Your mother's already been generous enough," Clay said. "That bread was mighty good. She's got more where that came from. But I didn't ride out here just to deliver food. I came to help, if you'll let me." Thomas gestured to the cabin. "This was your father's place. My mother says he was good to my family. Seems right to return the favor." Clay studied him. "You know I'm only here for another week or so. Timber company's taking the land, I heard. Doesn't change the fact that the roof needs fixing." Thomas dismounted and tied his horse. "I'm good with carpentry. Learned from my father before he passed. If you got materials, I can help you finish that roof before your time's up." There was something in the young man's earnestness that made it impossible to refuse. Clay nodded. "All right. I've got some spare lumber in the shed. Let's get to it." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, Clay up on the roof handing down old shingles while Thomas cut new ones to size below. The young man was skilled, his cuts precise and quick. They worked mostly in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that comes when two people are focused on the same task. Around midday, Thomas pulled bread and cheese from his saddlebag, and they sat in the shade to eat. Rust positioned himself between them, hoping for scraps. "My mother told me you used to live here as a boy," Thomas said, tearing off a piece of bread, "until I was 14. My father died and I left. Biggest mistake of my life. Why'd you come back?" Clay chewed slowly, considering his answer. "I got tired of running. Thought maybe I could find some peace in the place where my life started." "Before everything went wrong," Thomas nodded as if that made perfect sense. "My father used to say a man's home is in his bones. You can leave it, but it never leaves you. Your father was a wise man. He was." Thomas threw a piece of cheese to Rust, who caught it mid-air. "Mother says you were famous." "A gunfighter," Clay's jaw tightened. "Your mother talks too much. She says you're trying to change. That takes courage. Takes desperation, more like." Clay stood, brushing crumbs from his pants. "Come on. Daylight's burning." They returned to work, and by late afternoon, they'd replaced most of the damaged section. Thomas proved to be not just skilled, but tireless, working with the energy of youth that made Clay feel every one of his 64 years. But there was satisfaction in the work, in seeing the roof take shape, in the solid sound of hammers driving nails true. As the sun began to set, Thomas gathered his tools. "I can come back tomorrow if you'd like. We can finish the rest." "I'd appreciate that." Thomas mounted his horse, then paused. "Mr. Bannon, I know it's not my place to say, but what the timber company is doing, it's not right. My family's been in this valley for 12 years. We've seen companies come in and take what they want, push out the people who were here first. Legal or not, it's not right. The law says otherwise. The law's not always just. My father taught me that too. Thomas tipped his hat. I'll see you in the morning. Clay watched him ride away, thinking about the young man's words. Legal and just weren't always the same thing. He'd known that his whole life had used that knowledge to justify things that had no justification. But now, on the receiving end, he understood it from a different angle. That night, as Clay prepared his simple dinner, he found himself thinking about community, about Eleanor Wright bringing bread and her son offering labor, about his father helping neighbors, building barns, sharing seed corn. His father had understood something Clay had spent his life ignoring, that people needed each other, that kindness and cooperation made survival possible in a hard land. Clay had always been alone, had preferred it that way. No attachments meant no weaknesses, no one to lose, no one to disappoint. But sitting here now in his father's cabin, eating bread baked by a neighbor's hands, seeing repairs made possible by a young man's generosity, he wondered if he'd been wrong about that too. He pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil stub he used for keeping accounts. He started making a list, not of what he'd lost, but of what he might still have. Eleanor Wright, Thomas, the memory of his father. This cabin, even if only for a few more days. Rust sleeping by the fire. The Montana mountains standing eternal against the sky. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had in a long time. The next morning, Thomas returned as promised, and they finished the roof by noon. Standing back to look at their work, Clay felt a swell of pride. The cabin looked solid now, cared for, the way his father would have kept it. Thank you, Clay said, and meant it. Thomas smiled. You're welcome. My mother wanted me to invite you to dinner tomorrow night. Nothing fancy, just stew and conversation. Clay hesitated. Social situations had never been his strength. I wouldn't want to impose. You wouldn't be. She'd like the company, and truth be told, so would I. Gets lonely out here sometimes. Clay thought about refusing, about keeping his distance the way he always had. But he thought about his father too, about the man who'd helped his neighbors and built community in an isolated valley. All right. What time? Sundown. I'll come by and show you the way. After Thomas left, Clay walked up to his father's grave on the rise. He stood there for a long time, looking down at the valley spread below, the cabin with its newly repaired roof, the creek glinting in the sunlight. I'm trying, Pa, he said quietly. I'm trying to do it your way. I don't know if it'll be enough, but I'm trying. The wind moved through the pines, gentle and steady, and Clay took that as the only answer he was going to get. The next evening, Thomas arrived at sunset as promised. Clay had cleaned himself up as best he could, washed in the creek, trimmed his beard with a knife, put on his least worn shirt. Rust trotted alongside as they rode through the timber, following a trail Clay didn't know existed. The Wright homestead sat in a small valley sheltered by hills on three sides. It was modest but well-maintained, a cabin larger than Clay's, a sturdy barn, a chicken coop, and fields that had been harvested for the season. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed warm in the windows. Eleanor met them at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Mr. Bannon, welcome. Come in, come in. Don't mind the mess. There was no mess that Clay could see. The interior was clean and comfortable, with handmade furniture and curtains at the windows. A table was set for three, and the smell of stew filled the air, rich and savory. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a small collection of items, a pipe, a pair of spectacles, a worn Bible, arranged with care. Those were my husband's things, Eleanor said, noticing Clay's gaze. I keep them there to remember him by. Thomas thinks I should put them away, but I'm not ready yet. I understand, Clay said. Thinking of his father's cross, they sat down to eat. And the stew was as good as it smelled, venison and vegetables in a thick broth, with fresh bread still warm from the oven. Clay couldn't remember the last time he'd had a proper home-cooked meal at a family table. The conversation was easy, mostly Eleanor and Thomas talking about valley news, the coming winter, plans for spring planting. How many winters have you been here? Clay asked. 12, Eleanor said. My husband, Daniel, he had a dream of farming. We came from Ohio. The land was cheaper here, and he thought we could build something. It was hard at first. The growing season is short, and the winters are brutal. Your father helped us more than once. Mother doesn't like to admit how close we came to giving up that first year, Thomas added. If your father hadn't shared his supplies, we might not have made it. Eleanor nodded. Samuel Bannon saved our lives. Simple as that. So when I heard his son had come home, I knew we owed him whatever help we could give. Clay shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of generosity. I appreciate what you've done. The bread, Thomas helping with the roof. But you don't owe me anything. What my father did, that was him, not me. You're his son, Eleanor said firmly. That means something out here. After dinner, they sat by the fire. Eleanor poured coffee, and Thomas lit his pipe. The same pipe that sat on the mantel, Clay realized. The young man must have taken it down to use, to keep his father's memory alive in small ways. What will you do when your 2 weeks are up? Eleanor asked. Clay stared into his coffee. I don't rightly know. Keep drifting, I suppose. It's what I've always done. You could stay in the valley, Thomas said. Not on your father's land, but somewhere nearby. There's work to be had. The mines up north always need men. Or you could hire on with one of the ranches. I'm too old for mine work, and I don't know much about ranching. You know carpentry, Eleanor pointed out. You fixed that cabin up well enough. People always need things built or repaired. Clay wanted to believe it could be that simple. But he knew his reputation would follow him eventually. Someone would recognize his name, and then the work would dry up. People didn't hire known gunfighters to build their barns or fix their roofs. They crossed the street to avoid them. It's kind of you to offer ideas, Clay said. But I've lived a certain kind of life. That life doesn't lead to settling down and being part of a community. Eleanor set down her cup. Mr. Bannon, I'm going to speak plainly because I'm too old to dance around difficult subjects. I know what you were. Thomas told me what he'd heard in town. I don't care. My husband used to say that a man isn't defined by his worst day. He's defined by what he does after. You came back here looking for peace. That tells me you're trying to be different. And that's enough for me. Clay felt something tighten in his chest. I've done things, Mrs. Wright, terrible things. I've killed men. Too many men, and now you're trying not to. That's what matters. The timber company knows what I am. That lawyer, Cordell, he made it clear he'd researched me. Called me by my full name. If he knows, others will find out. Thomas leaned forward. Let them find out. Most of the men in this valley have pasts they're not proud of. Half the miners were outlaws at some point. The man who runs the general store in Timber Ridge killed a man in Denver over a woman. We don't judge people by where they came from. We judge them by what they do here and now. It was a nice thought, idealistic even. But Clay had seen how the world really worked. Your mother is kind to feed me, and you're kind to help me. But when Cordell comes back with his workers, I'll leave peaceful. I won't bring trouble to this valley. What if there was a way to fight without bringing trouble? Eleanor asked. Clay looked at her. The lawyer said the law is clear. I don't have a case, not a legal case perhaps. But what about a moral one? Eleanor stood and went to a shelf, pulling down a newspaper. She brought it to Clay. This is from last month. There's an article in here about the territorial governor. He's been making speeches about protecting small landholders from big companies. Says Montana's future is with family farms and ranches, not corporate timber operations. Clay scanned the article. The governor's words were idealistic, talking about the spirit of the frontier and the rights of common people. Politicians say a lot of things they don't mean. Maybe, but what if you wrote to him? Told him your story? A man who spent his last dollar to buy his father's land, only to be cheated by a con man, now being pushed off by a Chicago company? Eleanor's eyes were bright with the idea. It's the kind of story that might get his attention. And if it doesn't, then you're no worse off than you are now. But if it does, if he decides to make your case an example, the timber company might back down rather than fight a public battle with the governor. Thomas nodded eagerly. Mother's right. It's worth trying. What do you have to lose? Clay thought about it. He'd never been good with words on paper, had barely finished school before his mother died. But Eleanor's suggestion had a desperate appeal to it. A way to fight that didn't involve his gun. Even if I wanted to try, I wouldn't know what to write. I'll help you, Eleanor said. We'll compose it together. Make sure it says what needs saying. Clay looked between them, this widow and her son who barely knew him, who were willing to help despite his past, despite everything. He thought about his father's cross hanging in the cabin, about the community his father had built through acts of kindness. All right, he said finally. Let's write a letter. Eleanor smiled and retrieved paper and ink from a drawer. They worked late into the night, Clay telling his story, while Eleanor shaped it into words that might move a politician's heart. When they finally finished, Clay read it over by lamplight, a simple, honest account of his life, his father's legacy, and his hope for redemption cut short by corporate greed. It probably wouldn't work. But it was something, a way forward that didn't involve violence or surrender. And for the first time since Cordell had ridden up to his cabin, Clay felt a small spark of hope. Clay rode to Timber Ridge the next morning to post the letter. The trip felt different this time, less desperate, more purposeful. He had a plan now, even if it was a long shot. Eleanor had sealed the letter with wax and addressed it carefully to the territorial governor in Helena. She'd even given Clay money for the postage, refusing to take no for an answer. The post office was a small room in the back of the general store. The postmaster, an older man with thick spectacles, took the letter and Clay's coins. Helena, eh? Important business? Could be, Clay said. Take about a week to get there, another week for a response if you're lucky. Longer if the governor's a busy man, which I expect he is. The postmaster stamped the letter and added it to a canvas bag. Mail coach comes through day after tomorrow. Clay thanked him and left. A week there, a week back. That meant 2 weeks minimum before he'd hear anything. Exactly when Cordell was due to return with his workers. The timing was impossible. Even if the governor responded favorably, it would be too late. He stood on the wooden sidewalk, feeling the fragile hope from the previous night begin to crack. He'd been foolish to think a letter could change anything. Politicians didn't care about one old man's troubles. They cared about money and power, and the Consolidated Timber Company had both. Mr. Bannon. Clay turned to find a man approaching, middle-aged, well-dressed in the manner of a successful merchant. He had a round face and a genuine smile. I'm Robert Chen. I own the general store here. I heard about your situation from Gideon Hart. Clay tensed. Seems everyone's heard. Small town, Chen said with a shrug. I wanted to tell you, what's happening to you isn't right. That timber company has been buying up land all through this valley. They're going to clear-cut everything, ruin the watershed, drive out the families who've been here for years. Your case is just one of many. Lawyer says there's nothing to be done about it. Legally, maybe not. But there are other ways to resist. Chen glanced around and lowered his voice. Some of us have been talking. Shop owners, farmers, ranchers. We're tired of these big companies coming in and taking what they want. We've been thinking about organizing, making it harder for them to operate, refusing to sell them supplies, that kind of thing. Clay shook his head. That'll just make them angry. They'll bring in supplies from elsewhere and make life harder for everyone here, perhaps. But at least we'd be fighting back. Better than rolling over. Chen studied Clay. I heard you were a fighter once. The kind of man who didn't back down. I was a killer. There's a difference, is there? Sometimes standing up to bullies requires more than polite letters. Chen must have seen something in Clay's expression because he raised his hands. I'm not suggesting violence, just resistance, making them understand they're not welcome here. That's not my fight, Clay said. I'll be gone in 2 weeks, will you? Or will you stand with the people of this valley? The people your father stood with? Chen's expression was earnest. Eleanor Wright told me what your father did for her family. He didn't have to help them, but he did. Because that's what neighbors do in hard country. We help each other. Clay felt the weight of expectation pressing on him. These people wanted him to be something he wasn't. A leader, a symbol, a man worth following. They didn't understand that he was just trying to survive. Trying to find a few days of peace before he disappeared again. I appreciate what you're saying, Mr. Chen, but I'm not the man you think I am. Maybe you're not. Or maybe you're exactly that man, and you just don't know it yet. Chen tipped his hat. Think about it. If you decide you want to fight, you won't be alone. Clay watched him walk back into his store, then mounted his horse and rode out of town. His mind churned with Chen's words, with the impossible situation tightening around him like a noose. He didn't want to be a symbol or a leader. He wanted to be left alone to fix up his father's cabin and live out his remaining years in quiet obscurity, but that choice had been taken from him the moment Cordell arrived with his legal papers. The ride back to the cabin took most of the day. When he arrived, he found fresh horse tracks in the dirt near the corral. Someone had been here while he was gone. His hand went to his gun as he dismounted, every old instinct firing. The cabin door was open. Clay approached cautiously, Rust growling low beside him. He pushed the door wider and stepped inside. A man sat at his table, older than Clay, maybe 70, with a weathered face and white hair. He wore rough clothes and held a tin cup of what looked like Clay's coffee. "About time you got back," the old man said. "Coffee's terrible, by the way. You need to boil it longer." Clay's hand stayed near his gun. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my house?" "Name's Moses Garrett. And it's not your house. That's the whole problem, isn't it?" Moses took another sip of coffee and grimaced. "I live about 6 miles north, up in the hills. Heard about your troubles. Thought I'd come see if the rumors were true." "What rumors?" "That Samuel Bannon's boy came home. That Clay Bannon, the gunfighter, is living in his daddy's cabin and getting pushed around by a timber company from Chicago." Moses set down the cup. "I knew your father, good man. We trapped together one winter when I first came to these mountains. He saved my life when I broke through ice on the creek. Pulled me out, got me warm, probably kept me from losing my feet to frostbite." Clay relaxed slightly, but didn't sit. "Seems everyone in this valley owed my father something. Most of us did. He was that kind of man, generous with what little he had." Moses gestured to the other chair. "Sit down, boy. I'm not here to cause trouble." Clay sat, Rust positioning himself between the two men. "I heard you sent a letter to the governor," Moses said. Clay's jaw tightened. "How do you know that?" "Chen's wife's sister works at the post office. Like I said, small valley. Word travels." Moses leaned back. "That letter's not going to work. Politicians don't care about one old man's land dispute. But I'll tell you what might work, making enough noise that it becomes a problem they can't ignore." Chen said something similar. "Chen's a smart man." "He's right, too. These timber companies think they can do whatever they want because nobody fights back. But if enough people make it difficult, refuse to sell, refuse to help, spread word to newspapers about what they're doing, it becomes a public relations problem. And companies hate bad publicity." Clay shook his head. "I don't want to start a war. I just want to live on this land. Sometimes you don't get what you want. Sometimes you get what you're willing to fight for." Moses stood. "Your father fought. Not with guns, with stubbornness and principle. He wouldn't let the hard country break him, and he wouldn't let bullies push him around. You're his son. Maybe it's time to show it." The old man let himself out, leaving Clay alone with his thoughts and his terrible coffee. Through the window, Clay watched Moses ride away into the timber. That night, Clay lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about his father, about the man who'd helped neighbors, who'd shared supplies when he barely had enough for himself, who'd stood up for what was right even when it cost him. Clay had spent his whole life running from his father's shadow, choosing violence over virtue, selfishness over community. Now at the end of his road, everyone wanted him to be his father's son. The question was whether he could be, or if he'd broken himself too thoroughly to ever be whole again. 3 days before Cordell was due to return, Clay was splitting wood behind the cabin when Thomas came riding up the trail at a gallop. The young man's face was flushed, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Mr. Bannon," Thomas shouted, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "You need to come back to town with me. Right now." Clay set down his axe. "What's wrong?" "There's a U.S. Marshal in Timber Ridge asking questions about you. He's got old wanted posters, and he's showing them around town." Clay felt ice form in his gut. "What's his name?" "Holloway. Marshal Ben Holloway. He rode in this morning and went straight to the sheriff's office." Thomas grabbed Clay's arm. "Mr. Bannon, one of those posters has your face on it. From 20 years ago. Says you're wanted for murder in Colorado." The world tilted sideways. Clay steadied himself against the woodpile, his mind racing back through decades of violence. Colorado, 20 years ago. That would have been 1875. A saloon in a mining camp called Silver Creek, a card game gone bad. A man who'd accused Clay of cheating, which was true. They'd both drawn, but Clay had been faster. The man had died in the street while the marshal was out of town. Clay had left before sunrise. "What does he want?" Clay asked. "He's asking if anyone's seen you," showing the poster around. Thomas's voice was tight. "If he finds you, he'll arrest me." Clay walked to the cabin, Thomas following. Inside, he grabbed his saddlebags and started throwing supplies into them. Jerky, coffee, ammunition. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked. "Getting ready to run." "You can't run. He'll track you down." "Then what do you suggest? Should I ride into town and turn myself in? Hang for something I did 20 years ago? I don't know. But running makes you look guilty." "I am guilty." Clay kept packing. "That man in Silver Creek, I shot him over a card game. It was stupid and pointless, and I've regretted it ever since. But regret doesn't change what happened." Thomas stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "My mother says you're trying to be better. Running away isn't better. It's the same thing you've always done." The words hit like a fist. Clay stopped and stared at the young man. "Get out of my way, Thomas." "No." I said, "Move. Make me." Thomas's jaw was set, his eyes blazing with righteous stubbornness. "You want to be the man your father was? Then stop running. Face this." They stood frozen for a long moment. Then Clay's hand fell away from his saddlebag. The boy was right. He couldn't keep running. Whatever transformation had begun in him over these past weeks had gone too deep. He sank into a chair. "What am I supposed to do?" Thomas sat across from him. "Tell me about Silver Creek, exactly what happened." Clay told him. The card game, the accusations, the draw, the man dying in the street. When he finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment. Who else saw it? Half the saloon. Maybe 15 men, then it was witnessed. "You both drew." "That's not murder, that's self-defense." "I was cheating. I provoked him. Did you draw first?" Clay forced himself to remember. "No, he went for his gun first." "I was faster, but he drew first. Then it was self-defense." Thomas stood. "I'm riding to Timber Ridge to talk to this Marshal Holloway. I'll tell him you're here, that you're willing to come in and tell your side." "Thomas, no." "Yes, because if you run, you're guilty. But if you face this, maybe there's a chance." Thomas paused at the door. "Be courageous, Mr. Bannon. Be your father's son." He left before Clay could argue. Clay sat alone, Rust whining softly at his feet, trying to control the shaking in his hands. 2 hours passed. Clay considered running, but stayed. Thomas was right. Running was what the old Clay would have done. When he heard horses approaching, Clay stood and moved to the window. 4 riders came up the trail. Thomas was in front, and beside him rode a man wearing a marshal's badge. Clay took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped outside. His hand stayed clear of his gun. The marshal dismounted. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and hard but not cruel eyes. "Clay Bannon?" "That's me. I'm Marshal Ben Holloway. I need you to come with me to answer questions about an incident in Silver Creek, Colorado, in 1875. "Am I under arrest?" "That depends on what you tell me." Holloway's gaze went to Clay's gun. "I'll need you to hand over your weapon." This was the moment. Clay could draw probably faster than Holloway, could go out in violence the way he'd lived most of his life, or he could be his father's son. Clay unbuckled his gun belt slowly and handed it to Holloway. "I'll tell you everything. But I want Thomas right there when I do." "As a witness," Holloway nodded. "Fair enough. Let's ride." In Timber Ridge, they gathered in the sheriff's office. Clay, Holloway, Thomas, and the local sheriff. Holloway spread out a yellowed wanted poster on the desk. It showed a sketch of a younger Clay, wanted for the murder of James Kincaid in Silver Creek, Colorado. $500 reward, posted by Kincaid's brother, who was also the mayor. "It wasn't murder," Clay said. "It was a fair fight. Kincaid drew first. I can name a dozen men who saw it. Can you prove it?" "No, it was 20 years ago." Holloway leaned back. "Then we have a problem. There's an active warrant, and you're admitting to killing Kincaid." Clay felt the walls closing in. He'd been a fool to think he could face this and win. Then Holloway did something unexpected. He pulled out a telegram from his coat. "Before I rode out here, I did some checking. Sent wires to Colorado. Found something interesting." He slid the telegram across the desk. Clay read it slowly, Thomas leaning in to see. The telegram confirmed that James Kincaid had drawn first, that multiple witnesses had testified to that fact, but that his brother, the mayor, had issued a warrant anyway and offered a reward. It also stated that the mayor had been removed from office 2 years later for corruption, and that many of his actions, including the warrant, were considered suspect. "I can't dismiss the warrant," Holloway said, "but I can tell you that based on this information, I don't believe you'd be convicted if it went to trial. The territorial prosecutor would likely decline to pursue it." Clay stared at the telegram, hardly daring to believe it. "So what happens now?" "Now I take you to Helena to see the prosecutor. If he agrees to drop the charges, you're free. If not, you stand trial. How long will that take?" "Week there, week back. Maybe another week for the prosecutor to decide. 3 weeks. Cordell would be back in 2 days. Even if Clay was cleared, he'd lose the land because he wouldn't be here to fight for it." Thomas saw the despair on Clay's face. "Marshal, is there any way to speed this up? Mr. Bannon has another legal matter that requires his presence here." Holloway considered. "I could send a wire, ask the prosecutor to review the case immediately. Might get an answer in a few days instead of weeks. But I can't guarantee anything." It was a thin hope, but it was hope. Clay nodded. "Do it, please." Holloway stood. "You're free to go for now, but you stay in Timber Ridge where I can find you. Don't make me regret giving you this chance, Bannon." Clay took his gun belt back but didn't put it on. He carried it in his hands like a burden he was learning to set down. Clay spent the next 2 days in Timber Ridge, staying in a room above the general store that Robert Chen insisted on providing free of charge. The waiting was agony. Every hour brought Cordell's return closer, and every hour the telegram from Helena failed to arrive felt like another nail in his coffin. Marshal Holloway had sent the wire immediately, laying out the evidence and requesting an expedited review. Now there was nothing to do but wait and hope that some territorial prosecutor in Helena would care enough about a 20-year-old case to review it quickly. Thomas visited every morning, bringing food and news from the valley. On the second morning, he arrived with more than breakfast. "There's been a meeting," Thomas said, setting down a basket of biscuits and bacon. "At Chen's store last night. About 20 people showed up. Farmers, ranchers, shop owners. They're organizing." Clay looked up from his untouched coffee. "Organizing what?" "Resistance. They've heard what's happening to you, and they're angry. The timber company has been buying up land all over the valley, and people are scared they'll be next. They want to make a stand. Thomas, that's foolish. They'll just get themselves in trouble." "Maybe, but they're doing it anyway." Thomas pulled up a chair. "They want you to lead them." Clay laughed bitterly. "Lead them? I'm sitting here waiting to find out if I'm going to hang for a 20-year-old killing. I can't even save myself, much less lead anyone else." They don't see it that way. They see a man who came back to make peace with his past, who got cheated and is still trying to do the right thing. Eleanor told them about the letter to the governor. Moses told them you handed over your gun to the marshal instead of fighting. To them, you're proof that standing up to powerful people is possible. I'm not a hero, Thomas. I'm a tired old man who's made too many mistakes. Maybe that's exactly what they need. Not a hero, but someone who understands what it costs to fight." Thomas leaned forward. "Cordell arrives tomorrow. If that telegram doesn't come before then, what are you going to do?" Clay had been asking himself the same question. "I don't know." "Well, you need to decide. Because tomorrow, one way or another, things are going to come to a head." After Thomas left, Clay sat alone in his room and thought about his options. If the telegram came and cleared him, he could return to the cabin and face Cordell. But even then, what could he do? The law was clear. The land wasn't his. All he could do was leave peacefully or be forcibly removed, unless the people of the valley really did resist. Unless they made enough noise that the timber company decided it wasn't worth the trouble. But that would mean dragging innocent people into his fight, putting them at risk for his sake. His father would never have done that, Or would he? His father had helped his neighbors, but he'd also accepted help when he needed it. He'd understood that community meant sharing burdens, not just benefits. That evening, Eleanor Wright arrived at his door with a pot of stew and determination in her eyes. She set the pot on the small table and fixed Clay with a look that reminded him of his mother. "You've been hiding up here feeling sorry for yourself," she said. "That stops now, Mrs. Wright, Eleanor, and don't interrupt." She ladled stew into a bowl and pushed it toward him. "Eat and listen. Tomorrow, when Cordell arrives, you're not going to be alone. There will be at least 30 people from this valley at that cabin with you. We're going to bear witness to what happens. We're going to make it clear that the Consolidated Timber Company isn't just pushing out one old gunfighter. They're pushing out the son of Samuel Bannon, a man who helped build this community." Clay shook his head. "I can't ask people to do that." "You're not asking. We're telling." Eleanor sat across from him. "My husband used to say that in hard country, people have two choices: stand together or fall apart. This valley has stood together for years. We've helped each other through harsh winters, failed crops, disease, loss. We're not going to stop now just because the threat wears a suit and carries legal papers instead of a gun. What if Cordell brings the territorial marshal? What if people get arrested? Then we get arrested. Sometimes standing up for what's right has a cost. We're willing to pay it." She fixed him with a steady gaze. "The question is, are you willing to let us?" Clay stared at the stew, steam rising from the bowl. "Why? Why would you risk so much for me?" "Because you're not just you. You're your father's legacy. You're proof that people can change. You're a symbol of everything this valley stands for: second chances, redemption, community." Eleanor's voice softened. "And because I think, deep down, you're becoming the man your father always hoped you'd be. We want to help you finish that journey." After she left, Clay ate the stew and felt something shift inside him. He'd spent his entire life alone, believing that solitude was strength and attachment was weakness. But these people were offering him something he'd never had: belonging. They were willing to stand with him, not because he was dangerous or useful, but because he was one of them. That night, he barely slept. He kept thinking about his father, about the man who'd carved a life from this hard land and helped others do the same. His father hadn't been perfect. The drinking that killed him proved that. But he'd understood something fundamental that Clay was only now learning: that a man's worth wasn't measured by how well he stood alone, but by how many people stood with him when times got hard. Morning came cold and clear. Clay washed, dressed, and strapped on his gun out of habit. Then he paused, looking at the weapon that had defined so much of his life. Slowly he unbuckled it and set it on the bed. He wouldn't wear it today. Whatever happened, he would face it as his father's son, not as Clay Bannon the gunfighter. He walked downstairs to find the general store already buzzing with activity. People were gathering: farmers with weathered faces, ranchers in work clothes, shop owners in their aprons. Robert Chen was organizing them, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Bannon," Chen said when he saw Clay, "we're ready. We ride out to your cabin in an hour. Marshal Holloway knows what we're planning. He's not happy about it, but he says as long as we remain peaceful, he won't interfere." Thomas appeared at Clay's elbow. Still no telegram from Helena. "But we can't wait any longer. Cordell will be at the cabin by noon." Clay looked at the faces around him, men and women who were willing to risk their own trouble to stand with him. He saw Eleanor near the door, her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. He saw Moses Garrett, the old trapper, checking his horse's tack. He saw faces he didn't recognize, people who knew him only through stories about his father. "I need to say something," Clay said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. People quieted and turned to listen. "What you're doing, what you're planning to do, it means more to me than I can express. But I need you to understand what you're risking. The Consolidated Timber Company has money and lawyers and connections. They could make life very difficult for this town, for this valley." "Let them try," Moses called out. Several people murmured agreement. "I'm serious," Clay continued. "If you do this, there will be consequences. They might refuse to buy supplies here. They might bring in workers from elsewhere. They might even try to drive some of you off your own land. Then we'll deal with it together, Eleanor said firmly. The same way we've dealt with everything else. Clay felt his throat tighten. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve any of you. Maybe not, Chen said with a slight smile. But you're getting us anyway. That's what community means, Mr. Bannon. We don't just stand with the people who deserve it. We stand with our own. They rode out together, a procession of 32 people on horses and in wagons. Clay rode at the front beside Thomas, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These people were trusting him, following him, and he couldn't let them down. The trail to the cabin seemed shorter than usual. As they crested the final ridge, Clay saw what he'd been dreading. Cordell's horse tied near the cabin, and beside it, a wagon with 4 workers. Cordell himself stood on the porch, holding papers, clearly surprised by the approaching crowd. Clay raised his hand, and the procession stopped at the edge of the clearing. He dismounted and walked forward alone, aware of everyone watching. Cordell stepped off the porch. Mr. Bannon, I see you've brought friends. Neighbors, Clay corrected. People who knew my father. People who have an interest in what happens to this valley. Cordell looked at the gathered crowd, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation. This doesn't change anything. The law is clear. This land belongs to the Consolidated Timber Company. I have a court order authorizing me to take possession today. Then you'll have to take possession in front of witnesses, Clay said. Every person here is going to remember what happens today. They're going to tell their friends, their families. They're going to write letters to newspapers. They're going to make sure everyone knows how the Consolidated Timber Company does business. Cordell's jaw tightened. Are you threatening me, Mr. Bannon? No, I'm promising you something. You can take this land. The law says it's yours. But you won't take it quietly. And every piece of timber you cut from this valley, every dollar you make here, will be tainted by the story of how you got it. Clay gestured to the cabin. This was built by my father 43 years ago. He helped every person here or their families. He made this valley a place where people could survive. And you're going to tear it down for profit. I'm following the law, Cordell said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. So am I, Clay replied. I'm leaving peacefully like you asked. But these people have a right to witness it. They have a right to bear testimony to what your company does. Before Cordell could respond, the sound of a horse galloping hard made everyone turn. A rider was coming up the trail at speed, one of the workers from town. He pulled up, his horse breathing hard, and thrust a paper toward Clay. Telegram came for you, Mr. Bannon. Just arrived. Clay took it with shaking hands and read the words that would change everything. Clay's hands shook as he unfolded the telegram. The paper felt impossibly thin for something that held his entire future. He read the words once, then again, barely believing what he saw. Charges dismissed, stop evidence. Supports self-defense, stop warrant withdrawn. Stop prosecutor McBride Helena. Stop. He looked up at the gathered crowd, at Cordell standing on the porch, at Thomas. The charges are dismissed. The warrant's been withdrawn. A cheer went up from the crowd. Eleanor clapped her hands together. Moses let out a whoop, and Thomas grabbed Clay's shoulder with fierce pride. But Clay kept his eyes on Cordell, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. That's good news for you, Mr. Bannon, Cordell said carefully. But it doesn't change the situation here. This land— Wait, Clay held up his hand. Mr. Cordell, you're a lawyer. You understand that sometimes the cost of being right isn't worth the price. Clay gestured to the 30 people surrounding them. You can force me off this land today. You have the legal right. But look around you. Every person here is a potential customer for your timber operation. Cordell's expression hardened. Are you suggesting they'd sabotage our operations? I'm saying they'll remember. They'll tell everyone they know that the Consolidated Timber Company pushed Samuel Bannon's son off his father's land. And when you try to hire local workers, when you need supplies, they'll remember. That sounds like a threat. It's a prediction. But it doesn't have to be that way. I have a proposal. Clay took a step closer. Your company wants to harvest timber from this valley. That's going to take years. You'll need workers, supplies, cooperation from the local community. Right now, you're making enemies of everyone here. What if instead you started by making a gesture of good faith? What kind of gesture? Sell me this land. A fair price. I don't have the money now, but give me terms. Let me work it off. I'll cut timber, I'll work as a laborer, whatever you need. But let me stay on my father's land. Cordell shook his head. My company doesn't make individual deals. Then maybe it's time you started. Eleanor Wright stepped forward. Mr. Cordell, I'm a widow with a small ranch. I need timber for repairs before winter. I'll buy from the Consolidated Timber Company at a fair price if you make this right. So will I, Robert Chen called out. The general store needs lumber. And my ranch, another voice added, one by one. People stepped forward, offering business, offering the kind of community support that could make or break a timber operation in a remote valley. Cordell held up his hands. I don't have the authority to make this decision. I'd have to wire my superiors in Chicago. Then wire them, Clay said. Tell them what's happening here. Tell them they can have 1 enemy or 30 allies. Let them choose. Cordell looked at Clay for a long moment, then at the crowd. If I present this proposal, what guarantee do I have that you'll honor your end? You have my word. And you have theirs, Clay gestured to the gathered people. In this valley, a man's word still means something. Cordell pulled out a leather notebook and wrote for several minutes. Finally, he looked up. The fair market value for this property is $800. With interest, that's approximately $1,000 total to be worked off over 5 years. Roughly $200 per year in labor. Clay's heart sank. He'd never saved that kind of money. But Thomas stepped forward. I'll help him work it off. So will others. And I'll guarantee it, Eleanor said firmly. If Mr. Bannon can't fulfill the contract, I'll cover the remainder. Cordell looked stunned. You'd risk that much for him? I'd risk it for Samuel Bannon's son, yes. Cordell closed his notebook slowly. I need to send a telegram. It'll take a day, maybe 2 for a response. Until then, Mr. Bannon, you stay on this property. If my company agrees to these terms, we'll draw up a proper contract. If they don't, then I'll be back to enforce the court order. That's fair, Clay said. Cordell mounted his horse. Before he rode off, he looked at Clay. Your father, Samuel Bannon, what was he like? The question caught Clay off guard. He was a good man. Better than me. He believed in helping people, in building community. He died believing in this land and these people. Cordell nodded slowly. I hope for your sake that faith wasn't misplaced. He turned his horse and rode down the trail, his workers following. As soon as they were out of sight, the tension broke. People surrounded Clay, shaking his hand, clapping his back. Eleanor hugged him, and Thomas stood there grinning. Thank you, Clay said to the crowd, his voice rough with emotion. All of you! I don't know how to... You don't have to say anything, Eleanor interrupted gently. This is what neighbors do. As the crowd began to disperse, Clay stood in front of the cabin and looked up at the mountains. Rust pressed against his leg, and Clay reached down to scratch the dog's ears. For the first time in 50 years, Clay Bannon felt like he might actually have a home. The next 2 days were the longest of Clay's life. He stayed at the cabin, working on repairs he might never finish, trying not to think about the telegram that would decide his fate. Thomas visited each morning, bringing food and optimism Clay couldn't quite share. They'll agree, Thomas said on the second morning. It makes business sense. Because they're a big company from Chicago, and they don't care what a handful of Montana farmers think. Clay drove a nail with more force than necessary. They've got lawyers and money. We've got good intentions. We've got each other. That counts for something. Clay wanted to believe it. On the afternoon of the second day, Rust started barking. Clay walked to the door. A rider was coming up the trail, Cordell alone this time. Clay's stomach tightened. He stepped outside and waited. Cordell dismounted, his face unreadable. He carried a leather document case. Mr. Bannon, may we talk inside? Clay nodded and led him into the cabin. They sat at the table. Cordell opened his case and pulled out papers. I received a response from Chicago, Cordell said. My superiors were not pleased. They felt I'd mishandled things, allowed sentiment to interfere with business. Clay's heart sank. So they said no. They did, initially. Cordell paused. But I sent a second telegram. I explained the community involvement, the potential for negative publicity, the business commitments. I made the case that your proposal was actually good business, and they agreed. With conditions. Cordell spread the papers on the table. The Consolidated Timber Company will sell you this property for $800. With interest over 5 years, the total debt is $1,000. You'll work for the company at standard wages, $2 per day. That's roughly 250 days of labor to clear the debt. Clay stared at the papers, hardly daring to believe it. They agreed? They did. But there are conditions. First, Eleanor Wright's guarantee must be formalized. If you fail to meet the terms, she assumes the debt. Second, you'll work under company supervision. Third, any timber on this property becomes company timber. And fourth, you must maintain peaceful relations with the company and its workers. Any violence, and the contract is void. I can agree to all of that. There's one more thing. My superiors want it understood that this is an exception, not a precedent. They're doing this because I convinced them it was good business. Clay understood. I understand. Cordell produced a pen and ink. I'll need your signature here, and we'll need Eleanor Wright's signature on the guarantee. She's at her ranch. I can ride there, no need. I stopped there on my way. She's already signed. Cordell showed him the document, Eleanor's neat signature at the bottom. She didn't hesitate. Said she'd promised, and she keeps her promises. Clay felt his throat tighten. Eleanor had guaranteed $1,000, probably more money than she had. If he failed, she'd lose everything. I won't let her down, Clay said quietly. See that you don't. Cordell pushed the papers forward. Sign here, Mr. Bannon. Clay took the pen. His hand shook slightly as he signed his name on the papers that would make him the legal owner of his father's land. When he finished, Cordell countersigned as witness. It's done, Cordell said, gathering the papers. You now own this property, subject to the terms we've discussed. I'll file these with the Territorial Land Office. You'll receive a copy of the deed once it's recorded. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mr. Bannon, what happened here changed my mind about some things. I came believing that law and business were all that mattered, but I saw something different. I saw people who cared more about each other than about money. That's rare. My father understood that, Clay said. I'm just learning. Well, keep learning. I'll see you Monday morning at the timber site. 6 o'clock sharp. Cordell tipped his hat and left. Clay stood in the doorway and watched him ride away. Then he looked around the cabin, his cabin now, legally and truly his. He walked to his father's cross on the wall and straightened it. I did it, Pa, he whispered. I kept the land. I kept our home. Rust barked outside, and Clay went to see what had caught the dog's attention. Thomas was riding up the trail, Eleanor beside him, and behind them came a whole procession of people from the valley. They carried food and smiles. We heard Cordell rode by, Eleanor called out. Came to celebrate or commiserate, whichever was needed. Celebrate, Clay said, and couldn't keep the grin from his face. The land is mine. The cheer that went up echoed off the mountains. People gathered around, and someone produced a fiddle. And before Clay knew what was happening, there was music and dancing and more food than he'd seen in months. He stood apart for a moment, watching these people who'd become his community. They'd saved him when he couldn't save himself. They'd stood with him when he'd done nothing to deserve it. They'd shown him what his father had always known. That strength wasn't in standing alone, it was in standing together. Thomas appeared at his elbow with a cup that smelled like whiskey. To new beginnings, Clay took the cup and raised it. To community, and to second chances, they drank, and the celebration continued into the evening. And for the first time since he'd returned to his father's land, Clay Bannon felt truly at peace. Winter came early to the Montana mountains that year, but Clay Bannon was ready for it. The cabin stood solid against the wind, its roof tight, its walls chinked, its fireplace drawing clean. Inside, he had supplies enough to last until spring, dried meat and beans, coffee and flour, everything he'd need to survive the long, cold months ahead. He'd been working for the Consolidated Timber Company for 3 months now. 5 days a week when the weather allowed. The work was hard, felling trees, stripping bark, hauling logs, but Clay found satisfaction in it. His body was stronger than it had been in years, his hands steady from honest labor. The other workers had been wary of him at first, knowing his reputation, but they'd come to accept him. He worked as hard as any man half his age, never complained, and kept his gun hung on a peg in the cabin where it belonged. He'd made $75 toward his debt so far. Only $925 to go. At this rate, it would take him nearly 4 more years to clear it. But he had time now. He had a future that stretched beyond the next town, the next card game, the next man who wanted to test his speed. On a cold December morning, Clay stood at his father's grave on the rise above the cabin. Snow covered the ground, and his breath misted in the air. He'd carved a new cross from pine, better than the one he'd made as a boy, and planted it firmly at the head of the grave. "I kept my promise, Pa," Clay said quietly. "The land is ours again, and I'm living the way you taught me, working honest, helping neighbors, being part of something bigger than myself." He paused. "I wish you could have seen it. Wish you could have met the people who helped me. They're good people, the kind you always believed in." The wind moved through the pines, and a raven called from somewhere in the timber. Clay stood there a moment longer, then walked back down to the cabin. Inside, he found Rust asleep by the fire, the dog's muzzle gray now with age, but his spirit still strong. Clay scratched behind his ears, and Rust's tail thumped the floor, without the dog bothering to open his eyes. There was a knock at the door. Clay opened it to find Thomas and Eleanor standing there, both bundled against the cold. Thomas carried a package wrapped in brown paper. "Morning, Mr. Bannon," Thomas said. "Mind if we come in?" "Of course." "Coffee's hot." They came inside, shaking snow from their coats. Eleanor settled into one of the chairs Clay had repaired, and Thomas handed him the package. "What's this?" Clay asked. "Open it," Eleanor said, smiling. Clay unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside was a leather-bound book, its pages blank, waiting to be filled. On the cover, burned into the leather, were the words, "Samuel Bannon's Land, Clay Bannon, Proprietor." "It's a ledger," Thomas explained, "for keeping track of your work, your payments, your progress. Mother thought you should have a record of it all. Something to show what you're building here." Clay ran his fingers over the leather, feeling the craftsmanship, the care that had gone into making it. "This is too fine a gift." "It's not nearly enough," Eleanor said. "You've given this valley something important, Clay. You've shown us that people can change, that it's never too late to choose a better path. That's worth more than any ledger." Clay set the book on the table, too moved to speak for a moment. "I should be thanking you, both of you. Without your help, I'd have lost everything." "That's what community means," Thomas said. "We help each other." They drank coffee and talked about Valley News, who was doing what, who needed help with winter preparations, plans for spring planting. It was the kind of conversation Clay had never had in his old life. Talk of ordinary things, of neighbors and weather, and the rhythms of settled life. After they left, Clay opened the ledger and picked up a pencil. On the first page, he wrote the date and then began to record his story, not the whole violent history, but the part that mattered. The part that started when he came home. He wrote about buying the cabin, about Cordell's arrival, about the people who'd stood with him. He wrote about Eleanor's bread and Thomas's help with the roof and Moses's terrible coffee. He wrote about the letter to the governor that never got answered and the telegram that changed everything. He wrote about signing the contract and the celebration that followed, and then he wrote about the future he was building, one day of honest work at a time. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clay stood outside the cabin with Rust beside him. The valley stretched below, smoke rising from distant chimneys, lights appearing in windows as families gathered for supper. This was what his father had seen when he'd built this place. Not just land and timber, but possibility. A chance to build something that would last, to be part of a community, to leave something behind that mattered. Clay had spent 50 years running from this, believing that solitude was strength and attachment was weakness. He'd been wrong. The real strength was in standing with others, in accepting help, in admitting you couldn't do it alone. He thought about the men he'd killed, the violence he'd done, the years he'd wasted. Those things would always be part of him, scars that would never fully heal. But they didn't have to define him. He could be more than his worst moments. He could be his father's son. Rust whined and looked up at him, and Clay smiled. "Come on, boy. Let's go inside. It's getting cold." They went into the cabin together, and Clay closed the door against the winter night. He added wood to the fire, lit a lamp, and sat at the table with his new ledger. He had entries to make, records to keep, a future to document. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and steady, covering the valley in white. But inside the cabin, the fire burned warm, and Clay Bannon, gunfighter, drifter, lost soul, was finally home. He picked up his pencil and wrote, "Day 1 of the rest of my life. Weather cold but clear. Work good. Debt remaining, $925. Future possible." Then he set down the pencil, leaned back in his chair, and allowed himself something he hadn't felt in 50 years. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but something close. Something that felt like peace. The journey had been long and hard, and he'd made more mistakes than any man had a right to. But here, at the end of his road, he'd found what he'd been searching for all along, a place to belong, people who cared, and a chance to be better than he'd been. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.